overview for our attendees. While I'll just wait a few seconds to see if we have a bit of time for a couple quick questions, but lots of takeaways there. I maybe because we have some, interestingly, we have some a number of people international, and you mentioned GIDA, the Global Alliance, and maybe you could speak to this is a part of a larger development that's working internationally, is it not?
Yes, for sure. And I should note, I said biometrics like the whole time. I meant bibliometrics, guys. I'm so sorry. Like I said, this is new for me. I've never considered my academics on this kind of like scale. And so it's new space for me. But yes, bibliometrics, guys.
No,
Thank you.
no, that's fine. Okay, so just waiting to see if there's any questions coming in. Yeah, certainly a couple takeaways I had is the importance of relationships and relationship building, the new framework that you're introducing. So, for example, the FAIR principles, that's been talked about in our community for years, and for me personally, I just heard about CARE at your Wilfrid Laurier symposium, and the phrase "be fair and care" was introduces our attendees, our participants, to some new principles to consider. Yeah, so very lots of things. Question here. This is a topic that is so far-reaching. What other events have you been able to share your knowledge with? And also, can you tell us more about your PhD research?
Yeah, so it's definitely, if I'm being completely honest, I think I've presented in about 50 different forums in the last 2 years alone.
Yes.
And it's getting a little much. Like some weeks I get like 3 of these a week.
Yeah.
But this one was really interesting for me because it wasn't my typical, like usually I have a very broad, big conversation on Indigenous data sovereignty and governance, and I really get into, how do we push this? How do we move it forward? My PhD work, which is almost done, I'm very excited, is it's like a sandwich thesis, they call it, and so it's consisting of 3 different papers and a chapter that I'm kind of pushing together that are all around Indigenous data sovereignty in different spaces. So one is about looking at the importance of sovereignty and data in a time of COVID, relating to the survivance of First Nations people, and another is on the integration of Indigenous population data linkage in looking at data sovereignty from a lens of when you're linking population health data, what does that look like from an international perspective based on some larger perspectives. And the other is actually a really, I'm still writing it, so it's very fresh, but it's a conversation. So I had all these like global and national perspectives, and I was like, I need to bring this home. I need to do something for home. And so I actually decided, like, I'm gonna sit down with my grandmother. So I had tea with my kokum, and we talked about sovereignty, and it's really opened up how I view sovereignty, because everything that my grandmother had to share was about land. So our traditional family territory was taken from us and burned down to the ground, and is now crown land. You can go camp there, but it was our family territory, and my grandmother has so much to share about this, and so I'm using this opportunity and kind of this platform that I'm developing to like make a stand on behalf of my entire family who's still trying to get our land back. It was only taken in the 60s, and we're unceded. So yeah, it's I'm interested in seeing how it all comes together, but I'm nearing the finish line. I have some time set aside where I've only taken on 3 conferences in May to finish writing my PhD.
Okay, I think we have time. Super. Well, let's try to. We have. Well, let's give it a try. There's one last question here. I'm wondering whether there are any processes or markers downstream for libraries to determine and verify the provenance and integrity of the indigenous data, i.e., whether free, prior, informed consent has been obtained and continues.
Yeah, so there's definitely conversations happening about provenance in relation to Indigenous data. It's interesting because I think some people come at provenance and they think of it like, you know, where was this data created? And oh, I guess it was the hospital. So like the ministry, I guess, would be the provenance front end. But for Indigenous people, this is about like the person, the
Mm.
the like who does this information come from? And so sometimes, you know, when we think of like releasing, say, data from like 50 years ago, we write a report and we're like, we want to look at cancer rates 50 years ago, cancer rates to the present. And if that's like Indigenous based information, like you're talking about our ancestors, right? You're talking about our grandmothers and our aunties and our uncles. And so it's you know, even though that information comes from like a ministry or a data set that exists, it doesn't always mean that it should be accessed. But those conversations are still in their infancy. So there is currently like no standard for how to define provenance. It is something that I'm part of some bigger conversations happening through the IEEE. You're all familiar with what that is. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we just to keep on track with time, we'll have to wind it down. And again, super on behalf of the committee, super appreciate your contribution. And I know you've been drawn into so many of these talks. I did share the link with everyone and from the First Nations Data Information Governance Center with the Data Center. I think that's a good place for people to start to get familiar with some of the additional sources and so on. And yeah, we're very grateful for your participation and contribution. Thank you very much.
Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so it looks like we're ready for our next presenter.
Wonderful. I'm just setting up. Let's make sure that we can see my PowerPoint. Does that look all right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
I think as far as video, let me see. I think I started the PowerPoint a little bit too quickly. And let's see. There we go. Behind me is unfortunately a green screen because I share a home office. So this is just a way to make sure that everybody stays aware of the fact that I'm presenting.
Okay.
I would just like to thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I have attended BRIC as a participant for some years, and I'm a first-time presenter, so extremely excited for this opportunity, and just very honored also to be sharing the stage with fantastic presenters. And again, I'd like to thank Robin for her powerful presentation. It is a really powerful call to awareness. And just a very, very passionate sharing of ideas of awareness of, and I guess it's a powerful note to begin on. So if I may, I shall continue with my slide.
Yeah. Sorry,
Yes.
Joanna, if you don't mind, if just maybe give the attendees just a little bit of intro to.
Oh, absolutely. But
yeah.
George, please feel free to skip out on a bunch of things because I didn't know the length of the bio and I gave you my publication bio.
Yeah,
so yeah, please edit.
Yeah, so very quickly that we just wanted to highlight that Joanna is a PhD candidate at Science and Technology Studies at York University, and also a research services and liaison librarian with the psychology and anthropology departments at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. So I think with that, people know that the fuller bios are available in the full program. And with that, yeah, we can begin the talk and thank you very much.
Thank you again. I'll be telling a story today, and this is a story that once again has to do with a community. Unlike Robin's, this is a community that has seen some privilege, some exposure, but there are interesting things there. And this is all centered around a researcher who is very unusual. Now, before I do that, I would just like to show you that instead of hanging out at the UTM library there in the bottom corner, I'm coming to you today from northwestern Mississauga around Streetsville. And this absolutely gorgeous area has been a traditional land, or part of the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat people, the Seneca, and most recently Mississaugas of the Credit River, who are no longer here. So Robin would know exactly what I'm talking about. They're now close to the Grand River, and I think Laura yesterday mentioned some of the issues around that. Now, what am I researching? Part of my doctoral research involves the ways in which Jane Jacobs can be characterized as an outsider knowledge producer, also a somewhat transgressive knowledge producer. And I'm also looking at the extent to which Jacobs' influence on economic thought reflects a variety of debates about transdisciplinarity and issues such as trading zones. And I'll very briefly go into that. But mainly what I wanted to share with you today is some ways of looking at and some challenges of looking at how does Jacobs' thought contribute to economic debates and economic research. So who was Jane Jacobs? I think most of us know a little bit about her, and I'm not going to ask for participation. That always hurts me, because this is always the part when I would like to have a little bit of a show of hands. But Jane Jacobs is mainly known, and has been mainly known now as before, as a community activist around urban issues, urban design, and kind of an urban insight and urban design guru, right? So that's one slice of who Jane was. Of course, some of her critics, such as Lewis Mumford, more about him later, described her as a housewife, leading, let's say, a charge of picketing housewives trying to unseat Robert Moses from his grand plans to transform parts of New York City. And she was actually successful. She and her coalition successfully stopped the construction of a major expressway. But Jacobs then, with her husband and teenage sons, moved to Toronto in the late 60s, and she's actually spent many decades of her life away from New York City and living and working here, and working on such community issues as stopping the construction, the enlargement, because part of the construction was undertaken, but the enlargement of the Spadina extension of Allen Expressway. So what is special about her is that not only was she able to be so visible and so active and so galvanizing in many environments, she was a skilled journalist, a fantastic writer, but she had no university degree, no academic affiliation, and to all extents and to all intents, pardon me, and purposes, she was an autodidact. And a complete outsider to the discipline to which she thought she contributed the most, which is economics. So not even urban design, not even urban activism, no, urban economics itself. So let's take a little bit of a look at her output. You'll see that the first three books, and really the graphic design of my presentation for the most part reflects the design of these three books. The first three books have to do, obviously, with cities, but they really center around how cities are the place where economic activity arises, and how, in fact, advanced economic activity cannot exist outside of cities. The first three books really form the core of her cohesive vision. Here, we see the companion picture to the 1961 picture. This is Jacobs in 2004, 2 years before her death, and she's shown here with Spencer B. He was an environmentalist, I believe. He's still an environmentalist. Jane, of course, is no longer here. But the point is that throughout her years in Toronto, she was able to successfully move her advocacy, or at least the perception of her advocacy and her activism, away from just urban issues to, let's say, both larger issues around economic creativity, but then also issues that were later perceived as somewhat environmentalist. This is the Google Doodle for Jacobs's 100th birthday. And you can see that there are various scenes here from New York City. And this wonderful graphic summarizes many of the key insights that Jacobs contributed to the understanding of cities and to actually both a design and an economic understanding of cities. You see here that number 4 in particular, there it's short blocks. Eyes on the street. Eyes on the street is one of the phrases that's always associated with Jane Jacobs and her input. So here's a bit of a background, and I think it's beautifully put together by this quote from Saskia Sassen, a scholar, an urban scholar, and somebody who's written on Jacobs before. Jacobs helped us to re-emphasize dimensions of study about cities that were usually excluded, no, actually expelled from general analysis of the urban economy. I believe that somebody may be speaking as well. I know that Robin had some of these issues earlier. I do hope you can hear me. So even, oh, I think I'm still hearing somebody. All right. So who was Jane Jacobs? We've established some basics. What about her theory of economic developments? Remember the 3 book covers that we saw with publication dates through the 60s and early 80s. What was her theory? I think the easiest way to explain her theory is to look at 2 key terms, import replacement and export multipliers. And what's really important is the feedback loop that was established between them. So explosive city growth happened when city businesses wanted to do both more of the exporting of their goods, but also get more stuff, do more importing, do more innovating, do more working together. So it's the dynamics of the feedback loop here that are very unique. And also the fact that it's people who are involved. And Jacobs is always looking at people. So one of her key descriptions here, the master economic process that she describes, could be summarized with this citation from her 1984 work. Economic life develops by grace of innovating. So once again, people putting their minds and expertise together, and it expands by grace of import replacing. Now, this theory was really quite unique, quite groundbreaking. And how did it become influential? Well, first of all, we have to see why something that sounds to some extent intuitive, yes, inclusive of people, yes, inclusive of communities, quite deep, but intuitive, was so revolutionary in economics. Well, it was because especially through the 1950s, late 40s, and so forth, economics embraced what we would call a revolution. This was a formalism revolution. And what ended up happening in much of economics work henceforth was a focus on equilibrium. So not the dynamism that we saw in Jacobs, not the kind of complexity and the dynamics of self-organized complexity, but quite the opposite. Theories of value, formal descriptions of equilibrium, production functions, and mathematical formalism. So in the words of Ludwig Fleck, economics was a closed system of opinion, and it really didn't take to outsiders very well. And of course, Jacobs was the outsider. Everything she did came from a completely different perspective, and she consciously rejected the language of economics. Economists tend to talk about import substitution. Well, Jacobs chose, specifically in the economy of cities, to coin a new term, import replacement, that we saw as part of her dynamic definition of what cities are for and how they host economic life. She never talked about production functions or human capital, even though she wrote about people and what they did constantly. And one of the big criticisms of her work in economics was that, in fact, she didn't even define the city. You know, what is the function of the city? How do you conceptualize it? Another good way of summarizing Jacobs' thought is right here. An economy that contains few different sorts of niches for people's differing skills, interests, and imaginations is not efficient, right? So the idea of efficiency would be very familiar to economists, but the fact that an economy that doesn't diversify and doesn't allow for people to collaborate is not efficient would actually not occur to many economists, and especially not in that way. Another way in which Jacobs' insights hugely diverge from economics orthodoxy is seen right here. Here Jacobs is talking about the training of experts, here specifically planners, and she said that because planners have this bad training in deductive thinking, right? She herself worked mainly inductively. Planners frequently seem to be less well equipped intellectually, fighting words, for respecting and understanding particulars than are ordinary people. So we see here Jacobs, the firebrand that Sasson described before. She really does expel a lot of preconceptions about where economic activity and economic development comes from. So this approach appears to be what we would say incommensurable with that of mainstream economics, with orthodox economics, and it is largely true. However, as Peter Gallison, one of my gurus in looking at the relationships between boundaries and context in science, has written a fair bit about trading zones. And here he says that different subcultures, even though Jacobs was obviously completely outside of economics, and she was a member of a very different subculture, sometimes different subcultures can work out local trading zones in which they coordinate practices, but what they need is translators. Well, enter Robert Lucas Jr. Robert Lucas Jr. got his Nobel Prize in economics. Well, it's not really called the Nobel Prize, but let's just call it that. It's super important. And what Jacobs was able to do for Lucas is show him a way of talking about people, talking about these dynamic, self-organizing economic activities of people in a way that he's never encountered before. So what he did is he grabbed her ideas and translated them into a language that's comprehensible within his own epistemic culture of high orthodox economics, but development economics, right? So again, this was a discipline that intersected, at least in the realm of ideas, with what Jacobs was trying to do. So this article of his that I'm citing here on the bottom, the 1988 on the mechanics of economic development, is a hugely long but also strangely readable article in economics that lays out what Lucas thought about the origins and the mechanisms of what drives economic development. And here he said, this was a huge break for Jacobs, I will be following very closely the lead of Jane Jacobs, whose remarkable book, The Economy of Cities, seems to me mainly and convincingly concerned, though she does not use this terminology as we saw, with the external effects of human capital. Yes, so exactly, how do people contribute to economic development? So here really was Jacobs' big break. Somebody who was slated for the Nobel Prize noticed, cited very deeply in a breakthrough fashion some of her work, in fact, the work that she's been building up by now for years. So how can we examine what happened there at this junction between Jacobs's work and the work of Lucas, using a variety of bibliometric analyses? Well, that's about a third of what my dissertation is concerned with. And I started looking at the ways in which bibliometric analyses have been used since their inception, late 50s, early 60s, with, let's say, the more Mertonian bibliometricians, and then how they moved on to the constructivist realm, where bibliometrics is seen as a social activity, as something that helps those who cite situate themselves in their communities. And I particularly found the work of Richard Clavens and Kevin Boyack here instructive, because they describe this history in terms of early citationists and kind of more modern citationists. And they actually say that citations analysis in many ways has come full circle from the early days with Eugene Garfield, one of the huge pioneers of the discipline, who were using mainly direct citations, back to their own works. And Clavens and Boyack noticing that direct citation is actually maybe better at representing how knowledge develops and how disciplines meet in these trading zones and how they shear together at these boundaries than, let's say, co-citation or other kinds of bibliometric analysis. Network analysis is another kind of bibliometric analysis that I will show you some examples of in a moment, and I've been looking at. And Brugmans here shows that network analysis is actually absolutely fantastic at quantitatively expressing the results that we would often get intuitively from literature reviews, but it's able to show us exactly where it is the clusters that we're suspecting are forming, and which are the exact articles or which are the strings of citations that form the nucleus of these networks. Now, some of the tools that exist and have emerged about a decade ago or so are the VOS Viewer. VOS stands for Visualization of Similarities. This comes out of Leiden University Center for Science and Technology Studies, and we've heard about their work quite a bit. There's also the CIT or CitNet Explorer. I haven't used that one, so my experience is both in a kind of algorithmic historiography, and we'll see examples of that in a moment, and also some VOS Viewer work, and we'll see exactly what I've been trying to do and what are the challenges, because really I think that since I'm both a user of the techniques and somebody who supports them on the other end, as a research services librarian, understanding the challenges and understanding the issues is just as important as getting some results. So now we'll get a sense of both. So what I first wanted to do is situate the output of Jacobs. Once again, a very heterodox person, somebody with no formal background, in terms of the work of others with similar backgrounds. So here I am showing a Google Ngram for the output of Jacobs, also Robert Moses. So we know that Moses himself was not a scholar. Moses was a developer, a New York developer against whom Jacobs fought very publicly and ended up winning. So she opposed him. We see that there mentions in the corpus. This is the English language corpus of the Ngram viewer. So the mentions of their full names tracked each other after about the late 50s, but of course Moses, because of his predominance in New York, was hugely important. Now Lewis Mumford is interesting because Mumford was somebody who was very much a critic, so he was a public intellectual, but also mentioned in a lot of the academic literature. So he crossed the two fields very successfully, and he traveled back and forth. But as an urban and architectural critic, he would have been the one to notice or not Jacobs, and he actually panned her famously as a housewife. So we see that their Ngram mentions are definitely close for Moses and Jacobs, but Mumford's are significantly higher. However, the final thing I want to show you is that Jacobs seems to be on an upward inflection trajectory, whereas Mumford is definitely trending down. So now if we compare Jacobs to economic development academics, and here are the two big ones. So we've already met Robert Lucas. Now we're going to meet Paul Romer. Paul Romer is one of Lucas's students. Paul Romer has gained a Nobel Prize in economics as well. And his work in development economics is more quantitative. He himself comes outside of mathematics and applied math. And he moved into economics from that area. Now, what is really interesting about this, that while Robert Lucas's profile is somewhat noisy, and we can see that both of these names are rather common, and definitely a lot of cleaning of Google data would be needed to clean this one up. Romer, as an absolutely brilliant, outstanding academic, well, both of them, has a much smaller footprint in the Ngram than does Jacobs. And once again, both Lucas and Jacobs seem to be trending up, whereas Romer is stabilizing, although Romer has been in the news over the last year quite a bit. So a final look here, I've mentioned that Jacobs focused on the dynamic aspect of economic work and how important complexity, especially the complexity of human interactions, was. Well, let's take a look at two complexity theorists, Stuart Kauffman and Ilya Prigogine. Jacobs is a lot better represented in the N-gram corpus than even Prigogine, who's very well known for his complexity work. Now, when we take a look at the timelines of citations from Web of Science, and these are analyses that I carried out mostly last year in anticipation of this conference, but there is also some brand new work that I'll show you in a moment. I'd like to compare Jacobs to some development economists who were active at the same time as she was, and these are again academics. There is Walt Whitman Rostow, who also had a public profile because he was Lyndon Johnson's economic advisor. Actually, he was a national security advisor, but he definitely had the economics background. So his H index is around 100. Oh, here's Gunnar Myrdal. So his H index is higher than that of Rostow. I would say that his own output, though, and you can see that the citations to his publications are definitely trending down. I would say that while well respected in the 50s and 60s, I think his ideas will not survive very well. There is a lot of difficult stuff there. Albert Otto Hirschman, on the other hand, a fantastic and really well-respected economist, and you can see that citations to his work continue to rise. They're very strong. His H index is around 149, probably around 150 plus right now. And he's also had a public, quite a big public impact with this book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. So these are good comparators to Jacobs. Now take a look at Jacobs. Once again, she has absolutely no academic background. She wrote very few journal articles in academic publications in economics. So if you just try to go after Jane Jacobs herself, she emerges with a modest but still robust H index of 75. However, if you do a proper analysis, and this is about hundreds of pages in Web of Science, for Jacobs J, Jane Jacobs, Jane Jacobs Butzner, and actually go through the publications one by one, you end up coming up with a higher H index than any of the development economists that we've just looked at. So her H index is 186. And you see that the trajectory of citations is steady. Now, this is interesting. Jane Jacobs, if you just Google or look for Jane Jacobs, you are very likely to pop up with works published in the 2000s by a Jane Jacobs right now in Singapore. Any bibliometric work on Jane Jacobs has to disambiguate Jane M. Jacobs or Jane Margaret Jacobs. And this is something I, of course, found out the hard way over the last 2 years. Other issues with disambiguation have to do with cleaning up Web of Science data. So you'll see that there's a variety of ways in which all of her book titles are listed. Instead of death and life, people often say life and death. The most creative one is the death and afterlife of Great American Cities. I like to see that one. And of course, there are translations. So we have translations into Portuguese, translations into Spanish, and then there's citations to specific chapters. So this is a very important chapter on cities before agriculture. It's another contentious, exciting subject that she weighed in on. So there are at least 958 single items that are present in Web of Science for which citations exist. Another really notable thing is that right away we see the impact of the 1988 Lucas paper. Why? Because as you see here, her H index before that paper appeared was 13. After 1988, citation patterns to Jacobs exploded. We can see that of her citing articles, Lucas's article is still the one that's highest cited, and it is definitely the #1. Although if you compare this, so this original analysis here I did 3 years ago. Recently I redid this, and you can see that Lucas's article is still the most highly citing one, whereas there's quite a lot of movement. And #4 here that I've highlighted, complex adaptive systems, shows how important Jacobs is becoming to the complexity theory community. And that's something that I was hoping to see. I didn't expect it to see quite this clearly. So how does one visualize these networks of citations? And I'll try to zip through what is left fairly quickly, because I think we may only have 3 or so minutes left, and I've really rushed through some of the slides. So what do we need to do to visualize the networks of citations? Well, we have to have CSV files that can be used by the VOS Viewer. So I use dimensions, and I export files for bibliometric mapping, but dimensions doesn't do cited searches. At least I haven't figured out a good way to do it. So I put together, oh, okay, good, thanks, Jeffrey. So what I do is I put together searches, and I'm still refining them. This is one of the better ones. So this is one that I find is fairly successful after a lot of fails. In Dimensions, and I can talk about this a little bit more, but Dimensions is actually a really good database for this research, especially because it allows one to format bibliometric mapping CSVs that can be directly opened by VOS Viewer. I think it was Laura yesterday in her and her colleagues' fantastic presentation on the chord graphs that said that she really likes to stay within the environment so that she uses and learns all of its capabilities. Well, I'm trying to do that by matching what Dimensions can do together with the VOS Viewer, because I know that they were designed to work together. If you bear with me, I'll show you a few tricks I've learned to do in Dimensions. One thing I do right away is I try to limit to the subject area. So I select economics and applied economics. And my check for making sure that I'm getting a lot of the Jacobs work is to look at research categories. So in addition to economics and applied economics and econometrics, so of course, use of metrics in economics, I also get the human geography, and that's my first check. I know that this is right for Jacobs because a ton of her early economics flavored citations came from human geography, and they still do. So that's check number one. The other check is studies in human society, because that's where a lot of her complexity work, and especially the work that inspired the innovation-based economics work is going. So either human geography or the human complexity and human society tell me, yes, I got it. I'm in a reasonable area as far as this work is concerned. The other thing I really like to look at is the source title. So I see the Journal of Economic History, check, I really like that. Urban Studies, yes. Economic History Review, yes. But regional research and regional science, that's huge, because I know that if I've hit regional science, I've hit Taylor, and he's one of the better adapters of Jacobs' thought across the board. So not just the early economic stuff, but some of the later stuff like systems of survival. So that makes me very happy. The other thing I can see right away is some of the researchers. Seeing Edward Glaeser makes me very happy because he was another student of Lucas's. So I know that this is essentially straight from the horse's mouth. We've got Glaeser's connection to Lucas's work and also to Romer's work, although he diverged from Romer quite a bit because Paul Romer ended up going more in the quantitative direction, and he stopped citing Jacobs fairly early on in his career. Edward Glaeser never did. He still writes about Jacobs. So seeing him right up at the top there is really fantastic. Vernon Henderson as well, an important name. The Brady's an interesting one. That's when that name showed up at the top, I said, oh, I've got to investigate him because I didn't expect it. So right away, this slightly better designed foray into dimensions gives me new insights. But it tells me I'm in the ballpark. So what I then tend to do is I export the file. I've skipped some steps. I've actually got my VOS Viewer open, so perhaps if we have a moment, I'll show you the VOS Viewer later because I've got one of my visualizations in it. So I can do different kinds of analyses, and the ones I've played with around a lot are co-authorship, which makes sense since we're seeing Glaeser. We might be seeing more Lucas, and maybe Romer will show up, although unlikely. And also I can do citation analyses, right? So I'll show you examples of both very quickly. There are things to play with. So for example, if we're dealing with authors, we definitely want fractional counting. Why? Because we get a better representation of each author's input with authors that have tons of citation because there's normalization going on. I choose thresholds, making sure to be very sensitive here. And this is what I